Politics is about a community, your community. It's about where you live. It's about everything around us. It's about who we are as a people. I've always had a fascination with politics. Despite it being very difficult, very time-consuming, very stressful, I'd never give it up. The library, it's probably the best room, I think, in the building. It's absolutely magnificent.
Beautiful.
I took my family from Ukraine into here. I always look at my maternal grandmother, my babushka. She never let anything stop her in her way.
Would you change anything?
Well, I'd like to change the government. I get a free character assessment every day.
Okay.
So every day, someone tells me what they think of me, and every day, not more than one actually, people tell me how I should be doing my job. And that's just politics.
Hi, I'm Melina Reddy and welcome to Foreign Influence. Today we're in the centre of Melbourne at the Parliament House. We're about to interview the Honourable Matthew Guy, who is the leader of the Liberal Party. Matthew, thank you so much for being a part of our show.
My pleasure.
With the upcoming election, why do you believe you should be the Premier?
I think Victoria needs a change. I think we've had 8 years of a government that's been very hardline, talking down to people, lecturing people, lockdowns. I think the state is looking for something different. They're looking for something fresh and new and different. We're a health crisis in this state that needs to be solved. That's going to be my priority. First, second and third, fix the health system. We've got to make sure we put downward pressure on cost of living because it is certainly becoming much more expensive. Now, state governments necessarily can't take off federal taxes, but what we can do is make the problem worse by adding more and more taxes. And more than ever, I think we just need a change. We need a fresh approach, a different voice, and I think that's what Victorians are looking for.
If you were the Premier, how different would your response be to the pandemic?
We would have brought in the Defence Force very early, and they would have managed hotel quarantine, so we wouldn't have had the 800 deaths that occurred out of hotel quarantine. We changed the laws to make sure the Parliament oversights the government, not the government running everything. That's very important in a democracy, and it would mean that the pandemic laws the government passed we would scrap and start again. And also those state of emergency powers. We'd make sure that they are oversighted by people here in the Parliament, so all political parties have a say rather than just one man running the show. That's very important because I think Victorians are over the days of a one-man show. They want a government, not a one-man band.
How would your government be different to the current one?
We have an approach that is around working with people. When we build new infrastructure, you talk to new communities, how it will benefit them, how we can compensate businesses along the way, homeowners, rather than just running things through on our own agenda and not worrying about anyone else. We want to work with business, with lobby groups, with councils, with industry. We want to work with people. It's an approach that I think Victorians are looking for, actually talking with people. A government that works for us, not in spite of us. Not talking down to us and hectoring and lecturing. I think we need a government that just values Victorians, not just is in it for themselves.
What's the one message the voters need to hear?
You don't have to have more of the same. There is something different. It doesn't have to be this way. You can change. You can do that safely. And life can be better than what it is now. This isn't as good as it gets. So I say to voters, you can change and you can do it safely. A secure future from a change rather than just thinking that this is as good as it gets.
Let's talk about you as a person, not just as a politician. I was very lucky that I had the pleasure meeting your lovely mum, and I was so excited to learn that her and I, we were born in the same city, Kharkiv, Ukraine. Have you been brought up with many Ukrainian traditions?
We brought up around a lot of Ukrainians, obviously my grandparents. My mum and her brother only spoke Ukrainian. My family is all over there. My mum's family is all still in Ukraine. The only people who came out from Ukraine were my grandparents, my uncle and my mum, and then another uncle born in Australia. And all of our family is still in Kharkiv. They're all still there in Novovodolaha rayon. So we've been there a couple of times and caught up with them and met them, and it's lovely. We enjoy it. My grandmother in particular used to make beautiful Ukrainian food, and that was the most important thing because we all loved it. It was ponchiki or just magnificent vareniki. Anyway, we just loved it. It was part of our upbringing, something which we can never take away. My grandfather was very good with his hands. He'd make things like, many Ukrainians, Russians. He would make, benches, seats, chairs. And he made a beautiful trezub, which is the symbol of Ukraine.
Yeah.
And so I've still got it in my office today.
Do you have any siblings?
I have one brother. He's very different to me, totally different, but he's 2 years older.
How did your mom end up in Australia?
That's a good question. During the war, Ukraine obviously was part of the Soviet Union. They were in Kharkivska Oblast. The Nazis came in and then they went out and then they came in. And with that, a lot of Ukrainians had left. So toward the end of the war, my grandparents took the kids, or took my uncle, my mother was born a bit later on, and they went off to a displaced persons camp. They were south of Hamburg in Germany. And after the war, my mother was born in 1946. My auntie was born in 1944. She died during the war. My grandmother tells terrible stories about having to bury my auntie, who was a baby, during an air raid in Hamburg. That's just how it happened. But after the war, they had options, like many people did in displaced persons camps. They had options of Argentina, Brazil, Canada, or Australia. My grandfather wanted to go to Canada. A lot of Ukrainians went to Canada.
Yeah, it's a huge Ukrainian community.
Yeah, the prairie states are full of Russians, Germans and Ukrainians, as you know. But they missed the boat. They went to Naples and they missed the boat. They got all their papers, missed the boat. And
so it's not a figurative speech, it's actually what really happened.
They did. So the boats that were left were going to, I think, Argentina, Brazil and Australia. And my grandmother looked at the map and they said, well, where do you want to go? And they said, the furthest place from Europe. And so they picked this place, the furthest place from Europe, and that was Australia. My grandfather still wanted to wait for another boat and go to Canada because his friends were going there. Anyway, they came to Australia, and at Station Pier when they got off, or Princess Pier I think it might have been, my uncle tells this story, he was 7 or 8. The immigration officials were giving all the kids a block of chocolate, a big block of chocolate, Cadbury chocolate, because they were going on the train from there to Bonegilla, up near Wodonga. Yep. Back then, the kids not only had a little sweet or something in Europe, they hadn't had much because of the war and the Soviet Union. And to give this whole block of chocolate, they said the kids all thought
luxury.
This was just heaven on earth. They thought it was just absolutely magnificent. My grandmother, my babushka, tells some fascinating stories of Bonegilla because of all the different nationalities that came out to Bonegilla. The Italians used to give their children pomegranate seeds on the boats because they're full of vitamin C. And so when they got to Bonegilla, they didn't need to do this. So threw the pomegranate seeds out the window, they threw them away. Now in Bonegilla, there's all these pomegranate trees that have grown up around the Bonegilla camp.
How fascinating.
Which are seeds from the Italians who used to give their kids those seeds on the boats coming over. And it's a fascinating place to go to, back to Bonegilla, to have a look. My babushka used to say that it was so hot there, they'd have to put towels in the cracks in the floor because snakes would come up. And of course, these Europeans didn't know that they were venomous. And so there's snakes coming up. They tell some fascinating stories about Bonegilla and the first images of Australia, just wondering where everyone was because it was so quiet when they were getting the train into Melbourne and then looking around Melbourne and then getting the train up to the north of Victoria where they stayed for a year or so before being settled in the Latrobe Valley.
Are your relatives in Ukraine at the moment, are they safe?
We have some in Kharkiv, in the city, and others in the village. The ones in the city, some have moved and some we lost contact with. They were in the metro. You know, as I feel deeply sad, it's the last thing any Ukrainian, and I would hope any Russian would want, is to have a war between two. I mean, I think it's unfathomable. I can't believe that anything would come to that. I mean, they went to war together in the Fatherland War. They fought by each other side by side. They're predominantly both Orthodox nations, Pravoslavne, and I find it hard to believe that that would be the case. I just look at the destruction of places like Mariupol and Melitopol and others and think, how can this be in the year 2022?
Yeah, it's very disheartening. Yeah.
I think from all of us, particularly over here in Australia, you know, a credit to the Ukrainian and the Russian communities here in Melbourne and Australia, there hasn't been any relation issues between the two of us. People People want peace. We're in this country for one reason. We want to live peacefully with each other. None of us want to have any kind of conflict. And that's very important. We want peace overseas, but we also want it here in Australia. We don't want to bring conflict back to this country. One of the things that makes our country so wonderful is multiculturalism. And I think, that's important where there's been a lot of conflicts, in African nations, in the former Yugoslavia as well.
But there people were of different religions as well.
Correct.
So, yeah.
That's correct, and that's what makes the Ukraine-Russia conflict, in my eyes,
So
just
unbelievable.
and ridiculous. I can't believe it. I cannot believe it. So for 27 years, this was the National Parliament. So Australia's federal parliament sat here. This is the library. You can see it's beautiful. And all the gold is from the gold rush, which was taken down to Melbourne. The colony, as it was then, had all this money, so it was building the post office, the town hall, the exhibition buildings, the parliament. But then, of course, it ran out of money, and so because it ran out of the incessant amounts of gold, and so the parliament's only partially built. It's not completed, but thankfully this room this is a library, and it's probably the best room, I think, in the building. It's absolutely magnificent.
It's beautiful.
I take a lot of visitors. I took my family when they were here from Ukraine into here, and they looked at it and said, it's very English. I said, it is. It's what it's modelled on.
How did you develop your love for politics?
I was always interested in politics. I remember watching elections with my dad, in the early 80s, we watched elections. An uncle of mine, he was Polish. He gave me a Liberal Party badge at the 1983 election, and I wore it to school. My parents thought this was crazy because they weren't Liberal at the time. This was 1983, so I was only 9. And I just was interested in politics at the time. And so in 1990, when I was 16, I knew I could join the Liberal or the Labor parties. And back then there was really only the two major parties. So I rang, no internet that way, so I rang up the two parties and they sent out some material from each, and I knew from that moment that I was just interested in the Liberal Party and what the Liberal Party stood for. And so,
what was it about in particular?
Well, I'd watched my grandparents work so hard, I watched my parents work so hard, and I thought the people who worked hard like that should be valued by the government. We should always give a hand up for people who need it, but we should also reward those who put a lot of effort in. My grandfather had 2, sometimes 3 jobs here in Australia when he came out. They were not wealthy like many migrants. They went to the Latrobe Valley and worked on the power stations, and then on the weekends he was a concreter and concreted many driveways and things like that. And then on top of all of that, they'd buy a block of land and he'd be, in his spare time after all of that, building another house. And so when they'd got half a house built, they'd move into it and sell the one they were in. They'd kept doing this. So they all worked so hard. My grandmother, my baba used to paint the house on the inside when it was nearly done. So there are so many different stories from people who worked hard, and I just think governments should reward people for the effort they put in, and that was something that stuck out to me.
And how did your career develop? So you joined the party, and what happened next?
I joined the Liberal Party when I was 16 in 1990. I told my parents, they looked at me very strangely, like, why would you get involved in politics? Fair question. And I started going to young Liberal meetings, as they were. My school friends, I went to a public high school, and my school friends were always very, quizzical, like, why would you do that? So they were going to the pub, and I was going to a young Liberal meeting, and they were saying, how ridiculous, you better get something out of this, you better do something out of this. Ultimately I did. And after a few years, I actually got a job working with the Premier, with Jeff Kennett. So I worked with an MP in the country, in Hamilton, and then I worked with Jeff Kennett. And from then on, that was the path that was set. And I stood for Parliament in 2002 and I lost, and I stood in 2006 and I won.
Who was your mentor? Did you have a mentor?
That's a good question. Look, probably not early on. I helped a lot of people who were candidates, and I looked up to a lot of them. They worked very hard. There was a fellow in Eltham called Wayne Phillips. He was a member of Parliament. I liked him very much. I liked his style. I liked him a lot. And then as politics went on, Dennis Napthine, who was, I worked for Dennis when he was the opposition leader. We share the same birthday. He's a lovely man, a gentleman. I always liked Dennis very, very much. When I've led the party now, a couple of times, twice now, Jeff Kennett has been always very, very good. Jeffrey's always good to give you advice, and he's very, very he's a positive person. He doesn't always see the negative. He wants you to see the positive in situations. So those people have been very influential in a political sense in my life. In a personal sense, I always look at my maternal grandmother, my babushka, because, you know, to me, here's someone who didn't get a lot of schooling. She was from a selo, a village, and then came to Australia with her husband and children, and they started a new life. Her husband died when she was in her 60s, and she kept going for another 30 years by herself. She never let anything stop her in her way. She always cooked, she always worked. She never stopped until the day she died. She was the secretary of the Nubra Hromada for the Ukrainian community, and she's that for more than 20 years. You know, she's such a wonderful influence.
Amazing that you had all these people to inspire you.
Very much so, very much so. Certainly my grandmother. Now, this is a statue of Queen Victoria, who was the Queen at the time of Victoria being constituted. It's an interesting statue because the sculptor was heavily criticised by the palace because, first of all, the Queen is in a Roman toga, which is a very combative dress. And the second thing is you can see her foot and the length of her arms. And of course, that was very much a no-no for that period in the royal family. You couldn't expose that much skin for a royal
open toes.
Open toe. And of course, the left foot forward is a sign of war. It should be the right foot forward as a sign of peace. So they were very unhappy, very displeased with this statue, even though it managed to make its way. And by the time it was put up, the palace objected, but it was kept. And here it is in Queen's Hall in Parliament, Queen's Hall, because of Her Majesty Queen Victoria. This is the back of the Parliament. Where we're walking now, this is a new part of the building. It's called the Annex. So they've built all the parliamentary offices here. But the back of the building isn't finished, even though it's this magnificent, beautiful stone from the Grampians up near Hall's Gap. There were plans to finish it, to put the two wings, the south wing and the north wing on the building, but that was in the 90s, but that never happened. There's also plans originally to put a great big dome over the front of the building, but sadly it never happened. But this is the building we have today. It's impressive in the way of Australian parliaments, but it's still a shadow of what it would have been had it been completed. But that's Parliament of Victoria.
Would you change anything?
Well, I'd like to change the government. But apart from that, I think what we've got at the moment works well, so we'll probably keep it as it is.
Politics, well, the way I see it, politics is a very stressful career choice. People are always watching, and it seems like people are always judging. How do you deal with that?
I get a free character assessment every day.
Okay.
So every day someone tells me what they think of me, and every day, or not more than one actually, people tell me how I should be doing my job. And that's just politics. And after a while, you just learn to deal with it. You just learn to deal with it.
Do you sometimes walk away and you think, oh my God, I just want to just completely...
Sometimes I think I should have studied harder and become something like an architect or an accountant.
Well, you are an architect. You are building people's future.
Politics is about a community, your community. It's about where you live. It's about everything around us. It's about who we are as a people. I've always had a fascination with politics. And so, despite it being very difficult, very time-consuming, very stressful, I'd never give it up.
How do you relax? Can you relax? Are you allowed to?
Vodka, beer. I love to cook. I love to cook. And so cooking is how I relax, how I de-stress. So when I get the time, and I've got a son who's vegetarian, a wife who's pescatarian.
Oh, wow.
And then the rest of the three of us. Mm-hmm. So I will cook, and I will do three meals, and I'll cook like a restaurant. But I love it. It's relaxing.
I also really enjoyed meeting your family. They seem to be so supportive of you and very, very proud of you.
Hi, my name is Joey Gunn. I'm Matthew and Renee's older son. Despite seeing them on TV or talking to cameras, or endlessly talking to people at the shops about politics, I don't see my dad as a politician. He's just my dad. He makes fire in the fire pit, he's a good cook, he drinks beer, and he and my mum endlessly told my brothers and I.
Not Wayne.
He treats Wally, our dog, as another son. Actually, I think Wally's his favourite son. But I know he has an important job when he goes to work. My dad wants to make our state a better place to live for all of us, not just for some. He wants to see the city do well again. He wants to see country towns grow, and most importantly, he wants a Victoria that is a better place for my brothers and my generation than it is today.
I imagine it would be very challenging for them to have their father as such a public figure. Do you get any feedback from them?
My sons, I have three, they're 13, 11 and 9. They've grown up with me in politics. So I've been in politics 16 years. I've been an MP for 16 years. They've never known me as anything else. And more than that, for the last, the best part of 12 years, I've been either the opposition leader or a minister. So they've never known me as anything else but busy. The 2 years I was not the opposition leader, they were very pleased with because they saw a lot of me around the house. But I think after the end of that 2 years, they were happy for me to go and do something else. But anyway, my sons and I, we have a good relationship. We go away a lot. I say to my wife, you have some time for yourself and I'll take the boys away for a weekend. She thinks that's crazy because they're a handful. But we go away. We've been all around the southeast of Australia and more. We've been to all different places for weekends, for a week, for 5 days, for 3 days, overnight. My kids have, we've had picnics in the outback, flown drones north of Broken Hill, done all kinds of strange stuff. It's been rewarding. We love it. Love spending time together.
How did you meet your wife?
I worked with my wife. It's a funny story. And so we worked together for Denis Napthine when he was the opposition leader. We thought, we won't tell anyone we work with. And we thought for 2 years that no one knew. And
Did they?
when I stood for Parliament the first time, you go through a convention process to be chosen by the party, the Liberal Party. And I thought, I should bring my girlfriend, I should bring her, you're meant to go as a couple if you've got one. And I thought, I should, but I better tell Denis Napthine, he was our boss, I better go and tell him. So I went in and he said to me, good luck tonight, hope you go well. No problem. So I said, there's something I've got to tell you. And he kind of started to smile and he leaned back and he said, what would that be? And I said, I've actually been seeing Renee. And he looked at me and he said, I've only known for 2 years. So we thought no one knew, but Denis was smarter than the rest of us.
How soon did you get married after that point?
Not for some years. And then we had children pretty much straight after it. I was always obsessed by politics, so it was 2007, so a couple of years after that we then got married, then had children in 2008, 2010, 2012, nicely planned, and then 3 sons is enough. And my mum said, why don't you have one more, have a daughter? Typical Ukrainian wants more and more kids. I said, no, 3's enough. Why don't you have a daughter? You want more kids. Anyway, 3 is enough and 3 sons is plenty. I'm very happy with that and no more.
So do you think there might be a future politician?
No, my eldest wants to be a pilot. He's very obsessed with space and flight and everything to do with the flying, which is tremendous. He's got an interest and we try and push that. He doesn't want to be anything to do with politics, which is great. Nor does my middle son. He doesn't want anything to do with politics. He's obsessed by sport and online gaming, so that's him. And my little son is like an angel. He just looks at everything in the world with rose-coloured glasses. Everything is positive. He's a lovely soul to be around because everything's positive. If you ever need cheering up, I just talk to my youngest because he's always got something positive to say about everything.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, November is going to come around very, very soon.
Sure will.
We wish you all the best.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for being a part of our show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.